The silence that followed my words was the kind that presses against your eardrums. Not the comfortable silence of an empty room or the peaceful silence of a sleeping house. This was the silence of 43 people holding their breath at the exact same moment, the silence of a room waiting to find out what happens next. Forks frozen halfway to mouths, wine glasses suspended in midair. Even the background music from the restaurant speakers seemed to dim, as if the universe itself had leaned in to listen. And it had all started because David Harmon couldn't help himself. Let me back up. I had been working at Kellerman and Associates for 11 months when they brought Marcus Webb on board as the new regional director. Marcus was the kind of man who filled a room tall, broad-shouldered, with a handshake that lasted exactly 1 second too long, just enough to remind you who was in charge. He wore his confidence like a tailored suit, and for the first few weeks I gave him the benefit of the doubt. New authority, new energy. Maybe he'd be exactly what the department needed. I was wrong. What Marcus actually brought to Kellerman and Associates was a very specific variety of management style that I can only describe as performative competence, the art of looking exceptional while making everyone around you feel small. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply had a gift for making every compliment sound like an insult and every piece of feedback sound like a verdict on your worth as a human being. I watched him do it to others first, to Jamie in accounting, who he told had a lot of potential for someone without formal training, to Priya in analytics, who he praised for being surprisingly precise, to old Gerald from the third floor, who Marcus would publicly congratulate in a tone that made it sound like he was awarding a participation trophy to a child. I told myself I could handle it. I was good at my job. My numbers spoke for themselves. But I hadn't counted on David Harmon. David was Marcus's shadow, not officially, not by title, but in practice. He was the type of man who attached himself to authority the way barnacles attach to ships, without invitation, without purpose, but with remarkable stubbornness. He laughed at Marcus's jokes a half second after everyone else, always just slightly too loud. He echoed Marcus's opinions in meetings as if they were his own revelations. And he had developed, over the years, a particular sport out of targeting the people Marcus found dispensable. I had become one of those people. It started small, a comment here and there about my unconventional approach, a knowing smile when I spoke in meetings, as though my contributions were charming but ultimately decorative. The kind of low-grade, deniable condescension that HR would never act on and that a jury of colleagues would debate endlessly. I let it go. I kept working. I kept delivering. And then came the Hargrove account. The Hargrove account was the kind of opportunity that comes along once in a career, a $4.2 million contract that would reshape our entire Q3 portfolio and, frankly, prove to the partners that our department wasn't just functional but exceptional. Marcus had assigned it to his inner circle initially, to the team he trusted, the team that gathered around his desk like planets around a particularly self-satisfied sun. They struggled. For 6 weeks they struggled. The client was difficult, the requirements kept shifting, and the internal presentation kept landing flat. I know this because I heard the debrief. Everyone on our floor heard the debrief. Marcus had a voice that carried. Quietly, without making a production of it, I put together an alternative framework, not because I was assigned to, not because anyone asked, but because I could see where the existing approach was fracturing, and I had spent the better part of a decade learning exactly how to handle clients like the Hargrove Group. I'd worked with 3 nearly identical accounts at my previous firm. I knew the architecture of what they actually wanted, even when they couldn't articulate it themselves. I sent my proposal to Marcus directly, one Tuesday evening, with a subject line that read, "Alternative Framework for Hargrove, offered for your consideration." No fanfare, no campaign, just the work. He didn't respond for 4 days. Then, on a Friday afternoon, he forwarded it to the full team with a single line, incorporating some additional input for the revised pitch. He didn't mention my name, not in the email, not in the meeting, not in the revised pitch itself. But the pitch worked. Hargrove signed, $4.2 million, locked in before the end of the quarter. The celebration dinner was Marcus's idea. A restaurant downtown, the kind of place with leather booths and a wine list that required a sommelier to navigate. 43 people from the department, all gathered to toast the win. I came because declining would have looked like sulking, and I wasn't going to give anyone the satisfaction. The evening started pleasantly enough. People were loose and warm. The tension of the past weeks had dissolved, and genuine laughter moved around the tables like electricity. Even Marcus seemed human, cracking jokes, refilling glasses, telling the story of the final pitch with the relish of a general recounting a great battle. I noticed during that story that my name came up exactly once as part of a list. The whole team came together, he said. Everyone contributed, and then he moved on. I noted it, and I let it go. It was David Harmon, 3 glasses of red wine into the evening, who couldn't do the same. It happened during a lull between courses. Conversation had fractured into smaller clusters, and I had been talking with Priya and a newer colleague named Ben about the logistics of Q4 planning. I was mid-sentence, something about the timeline for the Henderson onboarding, when David's voice cut across our table from 2 seats down. "No offense," he said, which is the universally recognized prelude to something deeply offensive, but I want to say something. I turned. He was looking at me with that particular expression he reserved for these moments. A smile that was technically present, but which contained no warmth whatsoever, like a painting of a fire in a cold room. "You did solid work on the Hargrove framework," he said. "I'll give you that, but Marcus's wife, she built the Reynolds account from nothing 3 years ago. That was a $7 million close, solo. He let that land, then added with theatrical generosity, 'You'll never be as good as his wife, just so you know where the bar is.'" The table went quiet. The surrounding tables, drawn by some social instinct toward the pressure change in the air, went quiet too. 43 people suspended in that particular silence. I looked at David Harmon. I looked at his wine-flushed certainty, his borrowed authority, his small and second-hand pride. I thought about 11 months of quiet work and unattributed victories. I thought about the Hargrove framework and the email with no name on it. I thought about Jamie and Priya and Gerald from the 3rd floor. And then I smiled. Not a cold smile, not a thin, warning smile. A genuine, unhurried smile, the smile of someone who has just been handed exactly the words they needed. "I know," I said. David blinked. He'd expected defense, deflection, discomfort. The smile confused him. "I know she did," I continued. "The Reynolds account, $7 million, that's extraordinary work and she deserves every bit of credit for it." I paused. I actually studied that deal. The structure she used for the client retention clause was genuinely innovative. I borrowed part of that logic for the Hargrove secondary agreement, actually. A beat of silence. "The Hargrove framework," I said, conversationally, as though we were simply discussing interesting facts, was built on 3 previous accounts I handled at Meridian Partners. The Callaway Group, $9 million, the Brentwood Consortium, $11.3, and the Ashfield International deal, which closed at $14 million and was cited in the industry trade press as one of the most efficient enterprise-level closures of that year. I tilted my head. "I'm not saying this to compete with her. I'm saying it because you've introduced a comparison, and I want to make sure we're working with complete information." David's mouth had opened slightly. "Also," I added, and this is the part that landed the way a key turns in a lock, I had lunch with her last week. She's the one who told me about the Reynolds clause structure. She's wonderful, by the way. I think she'd find this conversation pretty interesting. The silence at this point had a texture to it. Marcus, from the other end of the long table, had gone very still. I picked up my water glass, took a sip, and turned back to Priya and Ben. "So Henderson onboarding," I said. "I was thinking mid-October makes the most sense, given the bandwidth situation after Q3 close. What do you think?" I found out later from Priya, who heard it from someone who heard it directly, that Marcus Webb's wife, Sandra Webb, who was, it turned out, a genuinely brilliant dealmaker at a rival firm, and not at all the passive trophy that David Harmon had clearly imagined when he invoked her name, had heard about the dinner conversation through the professional grapevine within 2 weeks. She had apparently found it hilarious. She had also, from what I understand, had a fairly pointed conversation with her husband about the kind of departmental culture he was cultivating, and the kind of people he was allowing to act as his proxies. David Harmon stopped making comments. Not immediately, not dramatically, there was no single moment of capitulation, but the remarks dried up. The knowing smiles became ordinary ones. The slightly too loud echoing of Marcus's opinions became a murmur, and then, eventually, a silence. Marcus himself became, over the following months, a more careful man. Not warmer exactly, but more careful. My name appeared in emails. My contributions were cited in meetings. It was the transactional respect of someone who has recalibrated their sense of risk, which isn't the same as genuine regard, but in a professional context, it functions nearly as well. What I want to be clear about, because I think it's the part that gets lost in stories like this, is that the reply wasn't clever because it was cutting. It wasn't satisfying because it was humiliating. It worked because it was true. Every number I cited was real. Every account was documented. The lunch with Sandra Webb was real. We had met at a cross-industry networking event 6 weeks earlier and had immediately, naturally, clicked. She was exactly the kind of person I aspire to be. Rigorous, generous with her knowledge, utterly unbothered by the need to diminish others in order to feel tall. The reply worked because I had spent years building the foundation that made it possible. Because I had studied the work of people I admired, including Sandra's, and incorporated those lessons honestly. Because I had kept records and kept showing up and kept delivering, even when the delivery address had someone else's name on it. David Harmon handed me a weapon that night, but the weapon was made of everything I had already built. There is a version of this story that ends with David being fired, or publicly shamed, or weeping into his appetizer, while everyone at the table started a slow clap for me. That's not what happened. Real life rarely delivers those endings, and honestly, I wouldn't have wanted it. Public humiliation might have felt good for 30 seconds and then started curdling. What actually happened was quieter and, I think, more durable. I earned a kind of credibility in that restaurant that I couldn't have purchased with 1,000 memos. The people at that table, the Priyas, the Jamies, the Bens, they remembered. And in the months that followed, they treated me accordingly. Not as a curiosity or a capable for someone, but simply as a colleague worth taking seriously. That's the thing about rooms full of people witnessing a moment. Most of the people in the room aren't the target. Most of them are just watching to see what kind of person you are. Are you someone who swings wild when threatened? Are you someone who collapses? Or are you someone who knows exactly what they're made of, doesn't need to prove it loudly, and is perfectly at ease letting the truth carry its own weight? I hope that night they saw the third kind. Sandra Webb and I still have lunch occasionally. She is, as advertised, extraordinary, the sort of person who makes you better simply by the quality of her attention. We have never directly discussed the dinner or David Harmon's strange invocation of her name as a yardstick for my limitations. We don't need to. What we talk about mostly is work, ideas, the architecture of deals, how to read a room, how to know when to speak and when to let silence do the work for you. She taught me that last one, actually. Or rather, she reminded me of something I already knew, that the most powerful thing you can do in a room that has gone quiet is refuse to panic. Silence isn't a vacuum you need to rush to fill. It's a stage. And if you know your lines, if you've done the work, lived the story, built the thing, you can stand on that stage without flinching. And whatever follows will be enough. The evening at the restaurant ended, as evenings do, with people gathering coats and cards and navigating the ritual exchange of good nights. Someone paid for the wine. Someone else made plans for a follow-up brunch that I'm fairly certain never happened. The valet brought cars around, and the cold night air of autumn did its reliable work of dispersing whatever electricity had charged the room earlier. I walked to my car alone. The city was its ordinary nighttime self, lit and indifferent and quietly magnificent in the way that cities are when you see them without needing anything from them. I sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. 43 people had held their breaths. I'd kept mine. That felt like enough.